Hey everyone, and welcome into this explainer. Politics used to be something we just casually discuss over dinner. But recently, comedian Jerry Seinfeld was talking with Adam Carolla about how incredibly fired up his longtime partner Larry David gets about today's political climate. He described a world where the tension is just so thick you can't even escape it in the writer's room. Friendships are literally fracturing because politics is now framed as an existential war. But while Hollywood legends are arguing over dinner, the rest of the world is literally catching fire. Today, we're diving deep into the Iranian Gambit and looking at how the strategy of force is shaping both the Middle East and our own domestic elections. All right, so here's the split-screen narrative we're going to be exploring today. 1, the Iranian retaliation. 2, Operation Freedom revealed. 3, the main Senate scandal. 4, framing the existential threat. And finally, 5, the cost of winning. Let's dive right in.
I want you to keep this question in the back of your mind as we go through this. What actually happens when every single conflict, whether it's happening across the globe or right at your local ballot box, is framed as the absolute end of the world? We are going to see exactly how the word existential is being used to justify the unthinkable.
Okay, Section 1, the Iranian retaliation, peeling back the layers. So the ceasefire in the Middle East, it has effectively evaporated. And it all started when an Iranian drone struck a U.S. Apache helicopter. According to the president, it was an absolute miracle the pilot survived because a flaming, massive heat-emitting projectile literally lodged right between them. In what is a first in military history, they were actually rescued by an unmanned drone boat in the Persian Gulf. But that miracle didn't lead to peace. The retaliation was totally vicious. U.S. Central Command launched 49 Tomahawk missiles in a single night, systematically peeling back Iran's radar and air defenses like an onion. And this brilliantly and starkly illustrates the administration's current strategy. With negotiations totally collapsed, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth basically warned the world that if they need to negotiate with bombs, they will negotiate with bombs. Diplomacy is off the table, replaced by sheer, undeniable military force. Which brings us to Section 2, Operation Freedom Revealed, escorting oil in the dark. While the whole world was glued to the explosions, a massive, previously classified secret was suddenly revealed: 100 million. For weeks, the U.S. military had been executing something called Operation Freedom, secretly escorting tankers carrying a staggering 100 million barrels of oil straight through the highly contested Strait of Hormuz, all in total darkness. Now you might be wondering, how on earth do you hide 100 million barrels of oil right under Iran's nose? Well, quoting President Trump directly, the mission succeeded because Iran's radar systems had already been, in his words, blasted to crap in previous strikes. And what makes this even wilder is that the Apache helicopter that was shot down, the one we just talked about, was reportedly providing the overwatch and protection for this exact secret mission. All right, let's dramatically pivot. Section 3, the main Senate scandal, a different kind of battleground. So, on one side of the world, in the Middle East, survival means literally dodging incoming missiles. But in the domestic political battleground of the main Democratic Senate primary, commentators are noticing that survival is being framed as stopping fascism. And that framing leads to an entirely different kind of warfare, one that is heavily defined by intense moral compromise. Case in point, conservative analysts are just baffled by the winner of that main primary, Graham Plattner. Look at his record on paper. He is deeply scandal-plagued. He's accused of domestic abuse. He has faced intense scrutiny for literally having an SS Nazi tattoo on his chest. He even allegedly posted on Reddit that U.S. soldiers deserve to die in combat. Critics are marveling that voters would throw their support behind a candidate, one described by some commentators as looking like an ogre who lives under a bridge, simply to defeat the opposition. Yet, despite all of that incredibly heavy baggage, Plattner won. How? Because he framed himself as a populist peace senator fighting against forever wars. He adopted this tone that really resonated with voters in Maine who were struggling with high fuel and healthcare costs. He promised to fight for the working class. And for a lot of voters, that populist messaging was totally enough to overshadow his highly controversial past. Moving on to Section 4, framing the existential threat, the paradox of modern politics. This right here is the psychological theme connecting our global and local stories. Analysts like Fox News' Greg Gutfeld argue that modern politics has created this massive paradox. When a party frames every single election as an existential fight against a fascist regime, against Hitler, voters will do whatever it takes to win. Ironically, that means they will accept a candidate with a literal Nazi tattoo just to stop the supposedly apocalyptic opposition. This has really birthed the blue no matter who phenomenon. It's a survivalist mentality. Voters and political supporters will absolutely excuse a candidate's glaring flaws, past abuses, or extremist symbols. The underlying logic is just that the opponent is such an incredible threat to democracy that you must vote for your party's nominee, regardless of who they actually are. Commentator Jesse Waters perfectly illustrates this with a concept he calls meth-mouth politics. It's this theory that modern political parties are just so deeply addicted to the high of winning that they completely ignore the ugliness of their own methods. Both sides no longer care how they look in the mirror as long as they get that victory. Finally, Section 5, the cost of winning, the casualties of polarization. Let's pull this all together and synthesize the split-screen reality we're seeing. In Iran, lethal military force is the ultimate tool when diplomacy fails against literal physical threats. In Maine, our domestic morality is heavily compromised when everyday politics is artificially inflated to feel like life or death. And fueling this whole fire, conservative media sources point to controversies around groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center, claiming they actually inflate hate just to keep the public locked in a constant state of existential fear. Which leaves us with this really vital question. If every election, every domestic disagreement is fought like a literal war for survival, what are the casualties of winning? When the goal is simply to crush the enemy at absolutely any cost, what do we lose in the process? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this look at the source material gave you a clear understanding of how the existential threat narrative is reshaping our world, both on the battlefield and at the ballot box. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.